The Galactic Council chamber stretched across 3 kilometers of polished crystalline floors, its domed ceiling displaying the swirling nebulae of the Andromeda Spiral in real time. Representatives from 47 different species occupied their designated areas, each space carefully designed to accommodate wildly different physiological needs. The Zephyrians floated in containment fields filled with their native methane atmosphere. The Crystalline Collective's delegates stood motionless, their silicon-based bodies refracting the chamber's light into rainbow patterns across the walls. The insectoid hive mind's speakers clicked and buzzed in perfect harmony, their compound eyes tracking every movement in the vast space. At the center of this magnificent display of galactic diversity sat a simple metal chair. Standard height, standard width, unremarkable in every way except for its complete ordinariness in a room designed to showcase the universe's most advanced civilizations. Ambassador Veltar of the Altarian hegemony looked down at the chair with barely concealed disdain. His people had ruled 3-star systems for over 2 millennia, their psychic abilities allowing them to influence the thoughts and emotions of most other species. The elongated skull beneath his ceremonial robes housed a brain capable of processing information at speeds that would overwhelm most organic minds. His pale blue skin seemed to glow with an inner light, a sign of the neural energy constantly flowing through his enhanced nervous system. The Terrans insisted on this, he announced to the assembled delegates, his telepathic voice reaching every mind in the chamber simultaneously. The words carried undertones of amusement and superiority that made several species shift uncomfortably. They said their representative required standard human accommodations, as if such a primitive requirement deserves consideration in this sacred space. A ripple of what might charitably be called laughter spread through the chamber, though the sounds varied wildly depending on the species producing them. The Aquatic Federation's delegates produced a series of harmonious bubble patterns. The machine intelligence of the synthetic collective generated a brief burst of electronic static that somehow conveyed mirth. The gaseous entities created small whirlwinds that danced briefly through their containment fields. High Consul Thrix of the Draconic Hegemony unfolded his massive wings slightly, a gesture that among his people indicated casual dismissal. Standing nearly 4 meters tall, even in his slightly hunched posture, Thrix represented one of the galaxy's oldest and most militarily powerful civilizations. His scales, each one the size of a human hand, shifted from deep emerald to lighter jade as his body temperature rose with amusement. The humans have been members of this council for exactly 73 standard galactic days, Thrix rumbled, his voice carrying the weight of centuries. In that time, they have attended exactly 0 sessions, filed exactly 0 proposals, and contributed exactly 0 meaningful input to galactic governance. Yet somehow, they believe their voice matters enough to request this emergency session. The Ethereal Collective's primary speaker, a being of pure energy contained within a complex field generator, pulsed with colors that indicated puzzlement mixed with condescension. Our analysis suggests the Terran species may not fully comprehend the significance of council membership. Perhaps they believe this to be some form of social gathering rather than the supreme governing body of galactic civilization. Ambassador KixTH of the Hive Mind clicked his mandibles in a pattern that his species used to indicate intellectual superiority. His multifaceted eyes reflected the chamber's lights as his head tilted at an angle impossible for vertebrate species to achieve. The collective consciousness has processed all available data regarding Terran psychology and social structures. The probability that they possess insights unavailable to our combined intelligence approaches 0. Their neural processing capabilities rank in the bottom percentile of council species. Their technological advancement required external assistance to achieve basic interstellar travel. Their social organization lacks the efficiency of hive mind consciousness or the discipline of proper hierarchical structures. The massive form of the Crystalline Collective's prime speaker resonated with harmonic frequencies that translated into words for the benefit of species that communicated through sound waves. This speaker has analyzed 14,000 years of galactic precedent. Never has a species so recently admitted to council membership requested an emergency session. The Terran representative was granted this opportunity only because council law requires that all member species be heard when they invoke the right of critical address. A right, added Ambassador Veltar, that was designed for species who had earned their place through demonstrated wisdom and capability, not for upstart primitives who stumbled into space travel mere decades ago. The chamber fell into the specific type of silence that occurs when powerful beings collectively agree on their superiority over a common target. For most of these species, the concept that humans might have something valuable to contribute was not merely unlikely, but fundamentally incompatible with their understanding of galactic order. They had ruled space for millennia, fought wars that reshaped star systems, created technologies that bordered on magic, and developed philosophical frameworks that guided the evolution of consciousness itself. The Altarians could read thoughts across light years of distance. The Draconic hegemony had never lost a military conflict in over 3,000 years. The synthetic collective processed information at speeds that allowed them to experience subjective years in what other species perceive as minutes. The Aquatic Federation had mastered genetic manipulation to such a degree that they could redesign entire ecosystems on a molecular level. The gaseous entities existed partially outside normal space-time, giving them perspectives on reality that other species could barely comprehend. What could humans possibly offer to such an assembly? The chamber's main entrance dilated open with a soft whisper of displaced air, and the council's attention turned toward the arrival they had been anticipating with such collective amusement. The figure that entered the vast space seemed almost comically small against the backdrop of the chamber's immense architecture and the imposing forms of the assembled delegates. She was a human woman, perhaps in her fourth decade of life by the appearance of her species, wearing what appeared to be a simple gray jumpsuit with various tools and devices attached to a utility belt around her waist. Her brown hair was pulled back in a practical ponytail, and her hands showed the slight staining and calluses that indicated someone who worked with machinery and electronics on a regular basis. She carried a small bag over one shoulder and walked with the steady, purposeful gait of someone accustomed to navigating complex industrial environments. What struck many of the assembled delegates as odd was not her appearance, but her apparent complete lack of intimidation. The Galactic Council Chamber had been designed specifically to overwhelm visitors with the scope and grandeur of galactic civilization. The ceiling's display of living stellar formations, the exotic architectures accommodating dozens of different species, the subtle energy fields that made the air itself seem to thrum with power. All of this typically left new council members speechless with awe. The human woman glanced around the space with what appeared to be professional interest, the way someone might examine a particularly complex piece of machinery they had been asked to repair. She noted the various environmental systems, observed the energy signatures of the different containment fields, and examined the structural supports that held the massive dome aloft. Her eyes lingered for a moment on the central chair, and she nodded slightly, as if confirming that it met some internal specification she had been expecting. "I am Engineer Sarah Chun," she announced as she approached the center of the chamber, her voice carrying clearly through the space without any technological amplification. "I represent the Terran Engineering Corps, speaking on behalf of the human colonies and the Sol System government. Thank you for accommodating this emergency session." High Consul Thrix leaned forward slightly, his massive head tilting with predatory interest. "Engineer?" The council was informed that Terra would be sending their most qualified diplomatic representative. Instead, they dispatch a maintenance worker. Sarah Chun stopped next to the metal chair and turned to face Thrix directly, seemingly unbothered by the fact that the Draconic delegate could incinerate her with a casual breath weapon. "I'm the person best qualified to address the situation that prompted this emergency session. My diplomatic credentials aren't as impressive as my engineering background, but then again, this isn't really a diplomatic problem. "Enlighten us," said Ambassador Veltar, his telepathic voice dripping with condescension. "What crisis could possibly require the urgent attention of the galaxy's supreme governing body? Have the humans discovered that their primitive technology has malfunctioned in some catastrophic manner? Do they require assistance with basic infrastructure maintenance that exceeds their limited capabilities?" The ripple of amusement that spread through the chamber was more pronounced this time. Several delegates seemed to be enjoying what they perceived as an opportunity to publicly demonstrate human inadequacy. The ethereal collective pulsed with colors indicating anticipation of entertainment. The hive minds clicking increased in tempo, suggesting heightened interest in what promised to be an intellectually stimulating display of interspecies hierarchy. Sarah-chan reached into her bag and withdrew a small device that looked remarkably like a simple tablet computer. She activated it with a touch, and the device projected a three-dimensional hologram into the space above the center of the chamber. The image showed a star map covering a significant portion of the galaxy, with various systems highlighted in different colors. 3 weeks ago, monitoring stations throughout Council space began detecting unusual energy signatures. She began, her voice maintaining the same calm, professional tone she might use to explain a routine maintenance procedure. The signatures were subtle enough that they didn't trigger any automatic alert systems, but they were persistent and they were spreading in a specific pattern. She touched the device, and the hologram zoomed in on a section of space near the galactic rim. Red indicators began appearing on various star systems, spreading inward toward the galactic core in what was clearly an organized progression rather than a random phenomenon. The energy signatures correspond to massive space-time distortions consistent with the construction of artificial wormhole networks. Based on the scale and coordination required, we estimate that whoever is responsible for these distortions has access to engineering capabilities that significantly exceed anything in Council records. The amusement in the chamber began to fade, replaced by something that might have been concern. The crystalline collective's harmonic frequencies shifted to indicate increased attention. The draconic hegemony's scales rippled as High Consul Thrix's body temperature changed in response to elevated stress hormones. Ambassador Veltar's psychic presence probed at the edges of Sarah Chen's mind, seeking to read her thoughts and verify the accuracy of her claims. He encountered something he had not expected. A human mind that somehow deflected his telepathic intrusion not through advanced mental training or technological protection, but through a kind of calm, methodical focus that simply refused to be disrupted. "Continue," Veltar said, his telepathic voice now carrying undertones of genuine interest rather than dismissive amusement. Sarah touched the tablet again, and the hologram shifted to display detailed technical specifications. The wormhole construction technique being employed is unlike anything in Council databases. Instead of using exotic matter manipulation or gravitational field generation, these wormholes appear to be created through direct space-time editing at the quantum level. The precision required suggests an understanding of fundamental physical laws that our current theoretical frameworks can't fully explain. "Who is responsible?" demanded High Consul Thrix, his wings unfurling slightly as his species' instinctive response to potential threats began to activate. "Unknown. The construction sites are completely automated, with no detectable signs of the species directing the work. However, based on the progression pattern and the technology involved, we can make some educated guesses about their capabilities and intentions." The hologram zoomed out to show the full galactic map again, with the red indicators now covering a substantial portion of the outer rim and continuing to spread inward. Mathematical projections appeared, showing the estimated timeline for the phenomenon to reach Council space. At current rates of expansion, the wormhole network will reach the outer borders of Council territory in approximately 14 standard months. If the builders maintain their current construction schedule, they will have completed a comprehensive transportation network connecting every major star system in the galaxy within 3 years. The purpose? Asked the prime speaker of the crystalline collective, harmonic frequencies indicating deep concern. Also unknown, but the strategic implications are obvious. Anyone with exclusive access to an instantaneous transportation network spanning the entire galaxy would have decisive advantages in trade, communication, and military deployment. They could reinforce any position faster than conventional FTL travel would allow. They could bypass existing infrastructure entirely. They could effectively control galactic civilization without ever revealing themselves or engaging in direct confrontation. The chamber fell into the kind of silence that occurs when highly intelligent beings suddenly realize they are facing a problem that exceeds their understanding and preparation. For millennia, galactic civilization had operated under the assumption that they were the most advanced intelligence in local space. Their technologies, their knowledge, their military capabilities had never been seriously challenged by external forces. The idea that someone or something might be casually constructing infrastructure that could render all of their advantages obsolete was difficult to process. It challenged fundamental assumptions about their place in the cosmic hierarchy. Ambassador KixTH of the Hive Mind clicked his mandibles in rapid patterns indicating complex cognitive processing. The collective consciousness has analyzed the data presented. The technological requirements for this construction project exceed our combined capabilities by orders of magnitude. If accurate, this information suggests the existence of a civilization that views our most advanced achievements the way we view primitive toolmaking. Exactly, said Sarah Chun, deactivating the hologram and returning the tablet to her bag. Which brings us to the question that prompted this emergency session. She walked to the simple metal chair and sat down, her posture relaxed and comfortable despite the fact that she was now the center of attention for representatives of the galaxy's most powerful civilizations. The contrast between her apparent casualness and the magnitude of the threat she had just described created a cognitive dissonance that left many delegates struggling to process the situation. The question isn't really about the wormhole builder's technology or their timeline, or even their ultimate intentions, she continued. The question is about us. About how we respond when we discover that we're not the most advanced intelligence in the galaxy. About what we do when our assumptions about our own superiority turn out to be wrong. High Consul Thrix leaned back slightly, his predatory instincts recognizing something in the human's tone that suggested she was leading toward a point that might be uncomfortable to hear. You see, Sarah said, her voice taking on the patient tone of someone explaining a complex technical concept to students. The Council's response to this crisis has been entirely predictable. When I filed the initial reports 3 weeks ago, the Altarian hegemony classified them as unsubstantiated claims requiring further verification. The Draconic hegemony assigned a junior military analyst to investigate, with instructions to focus on possible human deception rather than external threats. The Synthetic Collective concluded that the probability of such advanced technology existing was negligible based on their analysis of known physics. Ambassador Veltar's psychic presence flickered with what might have been embarrassment. Standard protocols require verification of extraordinary claims. Absolutely, Sarah agreed. But here's what's interesting about those standard protocols. They all assume that Council member species are the most likely source of any advanced technology, and that external threats can be evaluated using Council knowledge as a baseline. They're designed to identify problems that fall within the scope of existing galactic civilization, not problems that transcend it. The ethereal collective pulsed with colors indicating confusion mixed with growing concern. What alternative approach would you suggest? Sarah Chun stood up from the chair and walked to the edge of the raised platform at the chamber center. From there, she could look directly at each of the major delegations, her human eyes meeting the various optical sensors and sensory organs that serve the same function for other species. I want each of you to consider a question, she said, her voice carrying clearly through the vast space. Not as representatives of your civilizations, not as holders of ancient wisdom or advanced technology, but as individual conscious entities try to understand a universe that is larger and stranger than any of us fully comprehend. She paused, letting the words settle into the chamber's acoustic design, allowing the translation systems to process not just the literal meaning, but the emotional undertones that gave the statement its weight. What do you fear? The question hung in the air like a physical presence, creating a silence so profound that the normally subtle background hums of environmental systems became audible. Delegates shifted in their various accommodations, neural processes racing to analyze the unexpected nature of the inquiry. High Consul Thrix was the first to respond, his rumbling voice carrying the confidence of a species that had never known defeat. The draconic hegemony fears nothing. We have conquered every challenge through strength and courage. Sarah turned toward him, her expression remaining neutral and curious. That's not what I asked. I asked what you fear personally, not what your civilization has overcome, not what your species is capable of, but what keeps you awake when you're alone with your thoughts. The massive dragon-like being drew back slightly, his scales shifting colors in a pattern that indicated discomfort with the direction of the conversation. Ambassador Veltar, Sarah continued, turning toward the Altarian delegate. Your people can read minds across interstellar distances, influence the thoughts of other species, process information at superhuman speeds. What do you fear? The telepathic being's psychic presence probe at her mind again, seeking to understand the purpose behind her questions. Once again, he encountered that strange, calm focus that seemed to deflect his abilities without effort or hostility. I fail to see the relevance of personal psychological states to galactic security policy, Veltar replied, though his telepathic voice carried undertones that suggested he understood the relevance all too well. The relevance, said Sarah, is that fear is one of the most reliable predictors of intelligent behavior. When someone is afraid, they make choices based on avoiding what they fear rather than pursuing what they want. When someone is in denial about what they fear, they make choices that seem rational but are actually driven by unconscious avoidance patterns. She walked back to the center of the platform, her movements casual and unhurried. The wormhole builders represent something that challenges every assumption Council civilization has made about its place in the universe. Their technology suggests that your most advanced achievements might be primitive by comparison. Their construction timeline suggests that they view galactic-scale engineering projects as routine maintenance. Their apparent indifference to Council authority suggests that they don't consider your civilizations significant enough to communicate with directly. The words struck the assembled delegates like physical blows, each statement methodically dismantling the foundational beliefs that supported their sense of cosmic importance. So, I'll ask the question again, more specifically this time, Sarah said, her voice now carrying the kind of intensity that commanded attention without raising volume. What do you fear about discovering that you're not the most advanced intelligence in the galaxy? What do you fear about learning that your technology, your wisdom, your carefully constructed civilizations might be viewed as irrelevant by beings whose capabilities exceed your understanding? Ambassador KixTH's mandibles clicked in rapid, agitated patterns. The collective consciousness fears insignificance. We have spent millennia optimizing our society, our technology, our understanding of existence itself. The possibility that our achievements are primitive by external standards creates existential uncertainty that disrupts optimal cognitive function. The crystalline collective fears obsolescence, admitted the prime speaker, harmonic frequencies carrying resonances of deep anxiety. Our silicon-based consciousness has evolved toward increasingly pure forms of logic and efficiency. If our logic is insufficient to comprehend superior technology, then our evolutionary path may be fundamentally flawed. The ethereal collective fears dissolution, pulse the energy being's containment field, colors shifting through spectrums that indicated profound distress. We have transcended physical form through disciplined evolution of consciousness. If consciousness itself is insufficient to achieve true advancement, then our existence lacks foundation. High Consul Thrix's scales had shifted to colors indicating defensive posturing, his massive form drawing inward as much as his anatomy allowed. The draconic hegemony fears submission. We have never bent the knee to any force. Our honor, our identity, our very sense of self depends on maintaining sovereignty. If we are forced to acknowledge superior power, we become something we do not know how to be. Ambassador Veltar's psychic presence had withdrawn almost entirely from the chamber's collective consciousness, his telepathic voice barely audible when he finally responded. The Altarian hegemony fears irrelevance. Our ability to influence other minds is the foundation of our authority, our diplomacy, our sense of purpose. If we encounter intelligences that cannot be influenced or understood through psychic contact, then our greatest strength becomes meaningless. Sarah Chun nodded slowly, her expression carrying the satisfaction of someone whose diagnosis had been confirmed by careful observation. And now we're getting to the real issue. For 3 weeks, Council Civilization has been responding to the wormhole builders not based on rational analysis of the threat they represent, but based on unconscious attempts to avoid confronting these fears. She gestured toward the empty space above the chamber where her holographic display had appeared moments before. The data has been available for analysis this entire time. The construction sites are not hidden or protected. They're operating openly in systems that Council monitoring stations observe regularly. The energy signatures are distinctive and consistent, making them easy to track once you know what to look for. The technology involved is clearly beyond current Council capabilities, but it's not incomprehensible. Any one of your civilizations could have compiled the same analysis I just presented, but none of you did, because actually analyzing the situation would have required acknowledging that your assumptions about galactic hierarchy might be wrong. Instead, you dismissed the data as unreliable, classified it as a low priority, or simply ignored it entirely. The accusation hung in the air like an indictment, supported by evidence that no delegate could credibly dispute. The most advanced civilizations in the galaxy had failed to respond appropriately to a clear and present threat because doing so would have required confronting uncomfortable truths about their own limitations. The question now, Sarah continued, is whether we can move past fear-based decision-making and start addressing the actual situation. The wormhole builders are not going to disappear because we ignore them. Their construction timeline is not going to slow down because we're uncomfortable with their capabilities. Their intentions are not going to become benevolent because we prefer to believe that superior technology implies superior wisdom. She walked back to the simple metal chair and sat down again, her posture relaxed, but her attention clearly focused on the responses she was about to receive from the assembled delegates. I've told you what humans have observed and analyzed about this situation. Now I want to know what each of your civilizations is actually prepared to do about it. Once we set aside the question of whether you approve of reality and start dealing with reality as it exists. The chamber fell into contemplative silence as representatives of the galaxy's most powerful species found themselves forced to confront not only an external threat that exceeded their capabilities, but their own psychological limitations in responding to that threat. For the first time in millennia, the Galactic Council was being asked to acknowledge that they were not the pinnacle of cosmic evolution, and that their survival might depend on learning to think and act like the smaller, younger species they had always dismissed as insignificant. The irony was not lost on any of them that this lesson was being delivered by a human engineer sitting in a simple metal chair, asking questions that none of their advanced technologies or ancient wisdom had prepared them to answer. High Consul Thrix was the first to break the contemplative silence that had settled over the Galactic Council chamber. The massive draconic representative shifted his weight, causing the specialized platform that supported his 4-meter frame to emit subtle stress harmonics through the crystalline floor. His scales had transitioned from defensive posturing colors to the deep amber that indicated serious consideration among his people. The draconic hegemony possesses the galaxy's most formidable military capabilities, he rumbled, his voice carrying the weight of 3 millennia of undefeated warfare. Our fleets have conquered every system we have chosen to claim. Our weapons can crack planets and ignite stars. Our warriors are bred and trained from hatching to view death as preferable to defeat. Thrix's massive head turned towards Sarah Chun, his predatory eyes reflecting the chamber's ambient light like molten gold. But military supremacy means nothing if the enemy possesses transportation capabilities that render conventional fleet movements obsolete. If these builders can move forces instantly across galactic distances while our ships require weeks or months to reach the same destinations, then our numerical and technological advantages become irrelevant. The admission carried weight far beyond its literal meaning. The draconic hegemony had built their entire civilization around the concept of overwhelming force applied with surgical precision. Their military doctrine, their social hierarchy, their individual psychology, all of it depended on the assumption that superior strength would ultimately prevail in any conflict. However, Thrix continued, his scales shifting to colors that indicated strategic thinking rather than emotional distress. The hegemony has faced impossible odds before. When we first encountered energy-based life forms, our traditional weapons were ineffective. When we engaged the machine intelligences, our biological advantages seemed meaningless. In each case, we adapted our approach without abandoning our core principles. Sarah leaned forward slightly in her chair, her attention clearly focused on Thrix's words. What kind of adaptation are you considering? Reconnaissance in depth, Thrix replied immediately, as if he had been formulating the strategy while speaking. The builders may possess superior technology, but they are not omniscient. They construct their wormholes in uninhabited systems, suggesting they either cannot or prefer not to operate in areas with established populations. This implies limitations we could potentially exploit. The Crystalline Collective's prime speaker resonated with harmonic frequencies that conveyed analytical interest. This speaker concurs with the draconic assessment. The collective has processed the energy signature data presented by the Terran representative. The wormhole construction process generates distinctive gravitational distortions that would be detectable across interstellar distances. If the builders possessed truly unlimited capabilities, they could mask these signatures entirely. Ambassador Veltar's psychic presence emerged more strongly into the chamber's collective consciousness, his telepathic voice carrying undertones of grudging respect mixed with strategic calculation. The Altarian hegemony can contribute intelligence, gathering capabilities that exceed purely technological approaches. Our psychic networks can detect conscious thought patterns across light years of distance. If the builders employ organic intelligences or hybrid organic-synthetic minds in their operations, we may be able to locate and analyze their psychological profiles. Sarah nodded slowly, but her expression suggested she was hearing something more significant than just military planning. You're all talking about opposition and espionage, reconnaissance, exploitation, analysis of enemy psychology. Has anyone considered the possibility that the builders might not be enemies at all? The suggestion created a ripple of confusion throughout the chamber. Several delegates shifted in their various accommodations, neural processes clearly struggling to integrate this alternative perspective with their instinctive threat assessment protocols. Ambassador KixTH's mandibles clicked in patterns that indicated complex cognitive processing across multiple parallel thought streams. The collective consciousness has analyzed 17,000 historical precedents for technologically advanced civilizations encountering less developed ones. In 96.7% of cases, the advanced civilization either ignored the less developed one entirely or absorbed it through various forms of conquest or assimilation. The remaining 3.3% involve scenarios where the advanced civilization required something specific from the less developed one. Resources, geographic position, or unique biological characteristics. Exactly, said Sarah, standing up from her chair again and walking to the edge of the platform. Which raises the question of why the builders are constructing this wormhole network in the first place. Are they preparing for conquest? Are they creating infrastructure for their own purposes? Are they building something that they intend to share with other species? The ethereal collective pulsed with colors indicating deep uncertainty. The question implies the possibility of communication and negotiation. But if their technology exceeds council capabilities by the margin suggested, what could we offer that they would value? I don't know, Sarah admitted freely. But I think the more important question is whether we're psychologically prepared to find out. Because approaching them requires accepting that we might be the junior partners in any relationship that develops. High Consul Thrix's wings rustled slightly, his scales shifting to colors that indicated discomfort with concepts that challenged hierarchical assumptions. The Draconic hegemony does not accept subordinate positions. Then, the Draconic hegemony might not survive first contact with a civilization that views you the way you view primitive tool users, Sarah replied bluntly. Because if these builders are as advanced as their technology suggests, they're not going to be impressed by threats or posturing or declarations about what you will and won't accept. The chamber fell into another contemplative silence, but this one felt different from the earlier pause. Where the first silence had been driven by shock and denial, this silence carried the weight of delegates genuinely trying to process concepts that challenged their fundamental worldviews. The Aquatic Federation's delegate, who had remained silent during the initial discussions, suddenly activated their translation matrix to address the chamber. Speaker Coral, who dances between depths, represented one of the galaxy's oldest civilizations, her people having achieved spaceflight, while most council species were still developing written language. Her fluid form undulated gracefully within the specialized aquatic environment that maintained her life support requirements. The Federation has experience with situations where our technological capabilities were insufficient to achieve our objectives, she said, her translated voice carrying harmonic undertones that conveyed ancient wisdom. When we first attempted to terraform worlds with incompatible atmospheric compositions, we learned that superior technology does not always provide superior solutions. Sometimes cooperation with existing ecosystems produces better results than replacement or conquest. Sarah turned toward the aquatic delegate with evident interest. What kind of cooperation? Symbiotic integration. Instead of replacing the native atmospheric chemistry, we developed organisms that could thrive in existing conditions while producing the changes we required. Instead of imposing our preferred environmental parameters, we adapted our own biology to function efficiently in diverse conditions. The result was terraforming success rates that exceeded our purely technological approaches by orders of magnitude. You're suggesting that we might need to adapt to the builders rather than trying to force them to adapt to us, Sarah summarized. The Federation is suggesting that adaptation may be the only viable survival strategy when encountering genuinely superior capabilities. Pride and tradition are luxuries that intelligent species cannot afford when facing existential challenges. Ambassador Veltar's psychic presence flickered with what might have been irritation. The Altarian hegemony has spent millennia developing our telepathic abilities specifically to avoid the kinds of misunderstandings and conflicts that arise from inadequate communication. If these builders can be contacted through psychic networks, diplomacy remains possible. And if they can't? Sarah asked. Veltar's telepathic voice carried undertones of uncertainty that he was clearly reluctant to acknowledge. Then, the hegemony would need to develop alternative communication protocols based on technological rather than biological interfaces, which would require admitting that your greatest strength might be irrelevant to this situation. Yes, the simple admission seemed to cost Ambassador Veltar considerable effort, but once spoken, it appeared to create a shift in the chamber's overall emotional atmosphere. Other delegates began to relax their defensive postures slightly, as if acknowledging weakness had somehow reduced rather than increased their vulnerability. The gaseous entity's representative, who existed as a controlled atmospheric phenomenon within a specialized containment field, generated patterns of air movement that translated into words through the chamber's environmental systems. The entities have observed that consciousness manifests in forms too diverse for any single species to comprehend fully. If the builders represent a form of consciousness that transcends council understanding, then contact protocols may require approaches that none of our civilizations have developed independently. Meaning, prompted Sarah, meaning that successful communication might require collaboration between council species, pooling our diverse capabilities to create contact methods that exceed what any individual civilization could achieve alone. The suggestion hung in the air like a challenge to everything the council had ever represented. For millennia, galactic civilization had operated on principles of competitive advantage and species-centric superiority. Each member civilization maintained its council position by demonstrating unique capabilities that other species could not replicate. The idea of pooling those capabilities for mutual benefit ran counter to the fundamental assumptions that governed interspecies relations. High Consul Thrix's massive form shifted as he considered the implications. The draconic hegemony possesses military technologies and strategic doctrines that we have never shared with other council species. Our weapons, our ship designs, our tactical knowledge, all of it is classified at the highest levels of security. The Altarian hegemony's telepathic networks operate on frequencies and protocols that we have deliberately kept secret from non-telepathic species, admitted Ambassador Veltar. Our ability to influence other minds depends partly on their ignorance of our methods. The synthetic collective's processing capabilities are based on algorithmic approaches that we have protected as proprietary technologies, added the machine intelligence representative. Our computational advantages exist specifically because other species cannot replicate our methods. Sarah looked around the chamber, her expression carrying what might have been amusement mixed with professional assessment. So everyone's been playing poker with marked cards, and now you're being asked to play with the deck face up. An crude but accurate analogy, admitted the Crystalline Collective's prime speaker. The question becomes whether council species are capable of transitioning from competitive to collaborative frameworks when faced with threats that exceed individual capabilities. There's another question that might be more important, Sarah said, walking back to the center of the platform. Are council species capable of admitting that their individual capabilities might not be sufficient to understand, let alone address, the challenges these builders represent? She gestured toward the space where her holographic display had appeared earlier. Everything we've discussed so far assumes that council civilizations, working alone or together, possess the intellectual and technological resources needed to analyze the builder's methods and intentions. But what if that assumption is wrong? What if we're not just dealing with superior technology, but with forms of consciousness or intelligence that operate according to principles we can't comprehend? The chamber fell into yet another contemplative silence, but this one carried a different quality of thoughtfulness. Delegates were no longer simply processing challenges to their assumptions about galactic hierarchy. They were being asked to consider the possibility that their fundamental frameworks for understanding reality might be inadequate. Ambassador Kixth's mandibles clicked in slow, deliberate patterns that indicated careful consideration of complex philosophical problems. The collective consciousness has processed scenarios involving contact with incomprehensible intelligences. Our analysis suggests that successful interaction would require expanding our cognitive frameworks beyond current limitations. This implies accepting that our existing knowledge represents only partial understanding of universal principles, which is another way of saying that you might need to learn from the builders instead of trying to outsmart them, Sarah summarized. Yes, but Learning requires acknowledging ignorance, which conflicts with the self-concept that many council species have developed over millennia of technological and social advancement. The ethereal collective pulsed with colors that conveyed deep philosophical uncertainty. If the builders represent forms of consciousness that transcend our understanding, then traditional concepts of diplomacy, negotiation, and even communication may be inadequate. We might be attempting to establish relationships with intelligences that perceive reality in ways we cannot imagine. So how do we proceed? Asked High Consul Thrix, his voice carrying genuine curiosity rather than the defensive posturing that had characterized his earlier statements. Sarah Chun looked around the chamber one more time, her gaze taking in the representatives of civilizations that had ruled space for millennia, commanded technologies that bordered on magic, and developed philosophical frameworks that guided the evolution of consciousness itself. All of them were now looking to a human engineer for guidance in a situation that exceeded their collective understanding. "We start with what we know," she said, her voice carrying the calm confidence of someone who had spent years solving problems that initially seemed impossible. "We know the builders exist. We know they possess advanced technology. We know they're constructing infrastructure on a galactic scale. We know they haven't attempted to communicate with council civilizations through any channels we recognize." She paused, allowing each point to register with the assembled delegates before continuing. "What we don't know is why they're building this network, whether they're aware of our existence, what their long-term intentions might be, or whether they would be interested in any form of contact with us. Those are questions we can't answer through analysis or speculation. We can only answer them through direct observation and, eventually, through attempted communication." "You're suggesting an expedition to one of the construction sites," said Ambassador Veltar, his telepathic voice carrying undertones of both interest and apprehension. "I'm suggesting that we stop reacting to the builders as a threat and start approaching them as a mystery that needs to be solved," Sarah replied. "Which means setting aside our assumptions about what their existence implies for our place in the galactic hierarchy and focusing on gathering information that might help us understand who they are and what they want." High Consul Thrix leaned forward, his predatory instincts engaged by what he recognized as a strategic proposal. "What kind of expedition? A military reconnaissance mission? A diplomatic envoy? A scientific survey?" "All three, working together," Sarah said immediately, "because we don't know what kind of response we're going to encounter. We need military capabilities in case the builders perceive our approach as hostile. We need diplomatic protocols in case they're willing to communicate through conventional channels. We need scientific instruments in case their technology operates according to principles we don't understand. And we need representatives from multiple council species," added Speaker Coral, who dances between depths, her fluid form undulating with what appeared to be anticipation. "Because if the builders are as advanced as their technology suggests, they may require diverse forms of consciousness to achieve meaningful communication." The suggestion crystallized something that had been building throughout the conversation. For the first time in the Chamber's history, delegates were discussing a council operation that would require genuine cooperation between species rather than competitive demonstration of individual capabilities. The Draconic hegemony can provide military escort and defensive capabilities, offered High Consul Thrix, his scales shifting to colors that indicated strategic engagement rather than territorial defensiveness. The Altarian hegemony can contribute telepathic communication protocols and psychological analysis capabilities, added Ambassador Veltar. The synthetic collective can provide computational processing power and technological analysis equipment, offered the machine intelligence representative. The crystalline collective can contribute harmonic analysis and frequency-based communication methods, resonated the prime speaker. The ethereal collective can provide energy pattern recognition and consciousness detection capabilities, pulse the energy being's containment field. The Aquatic Federation can contribute biological adaptation technologies and ecosystem analysis protocols, said Speaker Coral, who dances between depths. Sarah Chun looked around the chamber, her expression carrying what appeared to be genuine surprise, mixed with professional satisfaction. "So you're all willing to share proprietary technologies and classified capabilities for a joint mission to contact beings whose intentions are completely unknown. The alternative," said High Consul Thrix bluntly, "is waiting for them to complete their network and discovering their intentions when they choose to reveal them. The Draconic hegemony prefers to gather intelligence rather than react to surprises. The Altarian hegemony concurs," added Ambassador Veltar. "Passive observation provides insufficient data for strategic planning. Active investigation carries risks, but it also provides opportunities to influence outcomes. The collective consciousness calculates that information-gathering operations offer superior probability outcomes compared to defensive waiting," clicked Ambassador Kixth. Sarah nodded slowly, but her expression suggested she was still processing the implications of what she was hearing. "There's one more consideration that we need to address before we start planning an expedition." "Which is," prompted the Ethereal Collective. "Who leads it? Because if we're approaching the builders as representatives of Council civilization, then the expedition commander needs to be someone who can speak for all Council species rather than advancing the interests of any individual civilization." The chamber fell into silence once again, but this time the pause carried a different quality of tension. The delegates had just committed to sharing their most closely guarded capabilities for a common purpose, but they had not yet addressed the question of who would coordinate and control those capabilities. For millennia, Council operations have been organized around the principle that each species contributed according to their strengths while maintaining their own command structures and strategic objectives. The idea of unified command under a single authority was unprecedented in galactic history. "The Draconic hegemony has never submitted to external command authority," said High Consul Thrix, his scales shifting toward colors that indicated renewed defensive posturing. "The Altarian hegemony's telepathic capabilities cannot be effectively coordinated by non-telepathic commanders," added Ambassador Veltar. "The synthetic collective's processing algorithms operate on timescales that organic intelligences cannot comprehend or direct efficiently," noted the machine intelligence representative. Sarah Chun stood up from her chair and walked to the center of the platform once more, her movement deliberate and purposeful. "Then we have a problem. Because approaching the builders as a collection of competing civilizations with different objectives and command structures virtually guarantees that we'll make exactly the kind of mistakes that prove we're not ready for contact with superior intelligences." She looked around the chamber, her gaze meeting the various optical sensors and sensory organs that served as eyes for the assembled species. "The builders have spent weeks constructing galactic-scale infrastructure while operating entirely outside Council awareness or approval. They clearly don't consider our political structures or territorial claims relevant to their activities. If we approach them as factional representatives advancing species-specific agendas, we'll just confirm their assessment that Council civilization isn't worth their attention." "What alternative do you suggest?" asked the Crystalline Collective's prime speaker. "Unified command under someone who doesn't represent any Council species," Sarah replied immediately. "Someone whose authority comes from competence and mission focus rather than political position or species-based advantages." High Consul Thrix's massive head tilted with predatory interest. "Are you volunteering for command authority over the galaxy's most advanced military and diplomatic assets?" "No," Sarah said calmly. "I'm volunteering to serve under the command of whoever is best qualified to lead a mission to contact intelligences whose capabilities exceed our understanding. If that happens to be me, then yes, I'll take the job. But if someone else has better qualifications for leading first contact with superior alien intelligences, then I'll gladly serve in whatever capacity maximizes mission success." The response created a cognitive dissonance that left many delegates struggling to process what they had just heard. Sarah Chun had simultaneously claimed authority over galactic civilization's most precious assets while offering to subordinate herself to anyone more qualified. The combination of confidence and humility was unlike anything they had encountered in millennia of interspecies politics. "What qualifications do you believe you possess for such a role?" asked Ambassador Veltar, his telepathic voice carrying undertones of genuine curiosity rather than challenge. "I'm an engineer," Sarah replied simply. "I solve problems by analyzing data, testing hypotheses, and adapting methods until they produce desired results. I don't have preconceptions about what should work based on political theory or species superiority or ancient traditions. I have training in systematic approaches to unknown variables and experience with projects that exceed individual understanding." She gestured toward the space around them, encompassing the vast chamber and the civilizations it represented. "I also don't have any emotional investment in maintaining galactic hierarchy or proving that any particular species deserves to rule space. My only objective is figuring out who the builders are and what they want, which means I can approach them without the psychological baggage that makes objective analysis difficult for species with millennia of invested superiority." Ambassador KixTH's mandibles clicked in patterns that suggested complex cognitive processing across multiple analytical frameworks. "The collective consciousness has analyzed the human's psychological profile and leadership qualifications. Her approach demonstrates cognitive flexibility and objective problem-solving capabilities that may be optimal for unprecedented contact scenarios." "The Aquatic Federation concurs," said Speaker Coral, who dances between depths. "Leadership based on adaptive competence rather than established authority may be necessary when facing challenges that transcend traditional frameworks." High Consul Thrix's scales shifted through several color patterns that indicated internal conflict between instinctive rejection of external authority and rational recognition of mission requirements. "The Draconic Hegemony will consider unified command structures if they demonstrate clear advantages for achieving strategic objectives. The Altarian Hegemony finds the human's psychological approach interesting," admitted Ambassador Veltar, his telepathic voice carrying undertones of what might have been surprised respect. "Her resistance to psychic influence suggests mental discipline that could be valuable when dealing with unknown consciousness types. The ethereal collective recognizes the logic of leadership selection based on mission requirements rather than political considerations. Pulse the energy being's containment field." Sarah Chun looked around the chamber one more time, her expression carrying the focused intensity of someone who had just accepted responsibility for a task that could determine the future of galactic civilization. "If Council consensus supports Unified Mission Command, then we need to start planning an expedition that can gather information about the builders without triggering defensive responses that could make future communication impossible." "Where do we start?" asked the Crystalline Collective's prime speaker. "With the next question that none of us want to answer," Sarah replied, settling back in her simple metal chair as if it were the command position for the galaxy's most important mission. "What do we do if the builders don't want to talk to us?" The question hung in the air of the Galactic Council chamber like a gravitational anomaly, bending the normal flow of diplomatic discourse around its implications. For 47 standard hours, the assembled delegates had been working through the logistics of organizing an unprecedented joint expedition to contact the wormhole builders. Ships had been requisitioned, technologies shared, and command structures tentatively established. But Sarah Chin's final question had forced everyone to confront the possibility that their carefully planned diplomatic mission might be fundamentally irrelevant. High Consul Thrix was the first to break the contemplative silence that had settled over the chamber. His massive form shifted with the kind of restless energy that indicated a predator recognizing the limits of familiar hunting strategies. The scales along his neck had transitioned to the deep crimson that among his people indicated serious contemplation of unpleasant possibilities. "The Draconic Hegemony has contingency protocol for scenarios where diplomatic contact fails," he rumbled, his voice carrying undertones of military precision. "If the builders refuse communication or respond with hostility, our fleet assets can establish defensive perimeters around critical council systems. We cannot match their transportation capabilities, but we can make any attempt to occupy our territory costly enough to discourage casual conquest. Ambassador Veltar's psychic presence flickered with what might have been professional interest, mixed with strategic skepticism. The Altarian hegemony's analysis suggests that traditional defensive strategies may be inadequate against technologies that operate outside conventional space-time limitations. If the builders can create wormholes that bypass normal travel distances, they can also bypass defensive installations that assume enemies will approach through predictable vectors. Exactly, said Sarah, her voice carrying the patient tone of someone working through a complex engineering problem. Which means we need to think about this situation differently. We're not planning a diplomatic mission with military backup. We're planning a reconnaissance operation that might accidentally discover whether diplomacy is even possible. The synthetic collective's representative processed this distinction with the kind of rapid analysis that allowed machine intelligences to evaluate multiple scenarios simultaneously. The operational parameters shift significantly if we prioritize information gathering over contact establishment. Mission success would be measured by data acquisition rather than communication achievement. Speaker Coral, who dances between depths, undulated gracefully within her aquatic environment, her translated voice carrying harmonic undertones that conveyed ancient patience. The Federation has experience with species that operate according to completely different temporal scales and priority frameworks. Sometimes, what appears to be refusal to communicate is actually indifference to the time frames in which other species expect responses. The builders may simply not perceive our existence as requiring immediate attention. Sarah leaned forward in her chair, her attention clearly engaged by the aquatic delegate's perspective, meaning they might be aware of us, but not consider us significant enough to interrupt their current activities. Or they might be operating according to decision-making processes that require years or decades to complete, suggested Speaker Coral, who dances between depths. Advanced civilizations sometimes develop bureaucratic or consensus-building mechanisms that prioritize thoroughness over speed. What we perceive as dismissive silence might actually be the beginning of a very slow conversation. Ambassador Kixth's mandibles clicked in patterns that indicated complex processing across multiple analytical frameworks. The collective consciousness has considered temporal mismatch scenarios. However, the wormhole construction timeline suggests that the builders are capable of rapid decision-making when it serves their purposes. Their apparent indifference to council civilization may reflect genuine assessment of our irrelevance rather than administrative delay. Which brings us back to the original question, said the ethereal collective, colors pulsing through spectrums that indicated philosophical inquiry. What do we do if superior intelligences conclude that we are not worth their attention? Sarah Chun stood up from her chair and walked to the edge of the platform, her movements carrying the kind of deliberate purposefulness that indicated she was approaching a conclusion she had been building toward throughout the entire conversation. We proved them wrong. The response created a ripple of confusion throughout the chamber. Several delegates shifted in their various accommodations, neural processes clearly struggling to integrate this statement with the logical frameworks they had been developing. Clarification requested, resonated the crystalline collective's prime speaker. How does one prove relevance to intelligences whose assessment criteria are unknown? By demonstrating capabilities they didn't expect us to possess, Sarah replied immediately. By approaching them in ways they didn't anticipate. By asking questions they find interesting enough to answer. High Consul Thrix's predatory instincts engaged with what he recognized as a challenge requiring strategic innovation. The draconic hegemony approves of approaches that demonstrate strength through unexpected capabilities. But what capabilities could council civilizations possess that would surprise intelligences capable of galactic-scale engineering? I don't know yet, Sarah admitted freely. But I think we've been asking the wrong questions about this entire situation. We've been focused on what the builders can do that we can't, and what that means for our place in the galactic hierarchy. But We haven't asked what we can do that they might not have considered. She gestured toward the assembled delegates, encompassing the diversity of species, technologies, and consciousness types represented in the chamber. The builders appear to operate with incredible efficiency and technological sophistication. They construct wormhole networks on schedule. They work without apparent supervision or coordination problems, and they accomplish galactic-scale engineering projects that would require council civilizations to coordinate resources across multiple star systems for centuries. That sounds like a description of capabilities we should envy rather than match, observed Ambassador Veltar. It's also a description of a civilization that may have optimized itself for efficiency at the expense of other qualities, Sarah replied. Think about it. When was the last time any of you made a decision that was strategically inefficient, but personally meaningful? When did you last pursue a project that served no practical purpose except curiosity or aesthetic satisfaction? When did you last change your approach to a problem because someone asked an interesting question rather than because analysis indicated superior results? The chamber fell into yet another contemplative silence, but this one carried a different quality of introspection. Delegates were no longer analyzing external threats or technical capabilities. They were examining their own civilization's approaches to existence and development. Ambassador KixTH's mandibles clicked in slow, deliberate patterns that indicated deep consideration of philosophical implications. The collective consciousness optimizes all decisions for maximum efficiency and logical consistency. Individual preferences that conflict with optimal outcomes are discouraged through social conditioning protocols. The synthetic collective eliminates decision-making processes that do not contribute to clearly defined objectives, added the machine intelligence representative. Emotional considerations, aesthetic preferences, and curiosity-driven investigations are processed only when they demonstrate measurable benefits to primary functions. The Altarian hegemony structures all social interactions around the enhancement and application of telepathic capabilities, admitted Ambassador Veltar. Cultural activities, artistic expressions, and personal relationships that do not contribute to psychic development are considered suboptimal resource allocation. High Consul Thrix's scales shifted to colors that indicated uncomfortable recognition of unflattering truths. The Draconic hegemony organizes all aspects of civilization around military effectiveness and territorial expansion. Individual dragons who pursue interests unrelated to combat capability or strategic value are viewed as failing to fulfill their genetic potential. Sarah nodded slowly, her expression carrying what appeared to be satisfaction mixed with professional assessment. So all of your civilizations have evolved toward optimization for specific capabilities. You've become incredibly effective at what you do best, but you've eliminated most of the qualities that make consciousness unpredictable, creative, or surprising. And you believe the builders have done the same thing? Asked Speaker Coral, who dances between depths. I think it's possible. Superior technology often comes at the cost of other qualities. When you can solve most problems through the application of advanced capabilities, you may stop developing the mental flexibility needed to address problems that can't be solved through straightforward application of those capabilities. The ethereal collective pulsed with colors that conveyed deep uncertainty mixed with growing interest. You're suggesting that our perceived weaknesses might actually represent advantages when dealing with hyper-optimized intelligences? I'm suggesting that chaos, inefficiency, and unpredictability might be exactly the qualities that make us interesting to intelligences that have eliminated those qualities from their own existence, Sarah replied. The builders can construct wormholes that span galactic distances, but can they write poetry that serves no practical purpose? They can coordinate engineering projects that require precise timing across multiple star systems, but can they argue about philosophical questions that have no definitive answers? They can process information at speeds that allow them to manage galactic-scale infrastructure, but can they waste time on activities that bring personal satisfaction without contributing to measurable objectives? High Consul Thrix leaned forward with the kind of attention that indicated his strategic instincts were engaged by unexpected tactical possibilities. The human is suggesting that our apparent inferiority might actually represent a form of superiority that the builders cannot achieve through technological advancement alone. Not superiority, Sarah corrected immediately. Complementarity. We might possess qualities that they find valuable precisely because their optimization process has made those qualities inaccessible to them. Ambassador Veltar's psychic presence probed at the edges of Sarah's mind again, seeking to understand the implications of her reasoning. Once again, he encountered that strange, calm focus that seemed to deflect his telepathic abilities through simple mental discipline rather than technological protection. The Altarian hegemony finds this hypothesis intriguing, Veltar admitted. If accurate, it suggests that contact with the builders might be mutually beneficial rather than inevitably hierarchical. It also suggests that our expedition should focus on demonstrating qualities the builders might find interesting rather than trying to prove that we're not threats or that we deserve their respect, Sarah continued. Instead of approaching them as supplicants seeking audience with superior beings, we approach them as representatives of a different kind of intelligence that might have something valuable to offer. The synthetic collective process, this strategic reorientation, with the kind of rapid analysis that characterized machine intelligence decision-making. The approach requires significant modification of planned expedition protocols. Instead of defensive posturing or formal diplomatic procedures, mission parameters would emphasize creativity, unpredictability, and demonstration of non-optimal behaviors. Which means the expedition team needs to include individuals who represent the full range of Council species' non-optimized qualities, added the Crystalline Collective's prime speaker. Artists, philosophers, individuals who pursue activities that serve no practical function but contribute to the diversity of conscious experience. Speaker, Coral who dances between depths undulated with what appeared to be growing excitement. The Federation has maintained cultural preservation specialists who study forms of consciousness and artistic expression that have no survival value. These individuals might be more qualified for builder contact than our most advanced scientists or diplomats. The Draconic hegemony has individuals who pursue non-military activities, admitted High Consul Thrix with obvious reluctance. Dragons who compose music, create visual art, or engage in philosophical speculation despite the lack of strategic relevance to these pursuits. The Altarian hegemony includes telepaths who use their abilities for artistic collaboration rather than practical communication, added Ambassador Veltar. They create shared consciousness experiences that serve no function except aesthetic enjoyment. The collective consciousness has preserved archived data about pre-optimization cultural activities, clicked Ambassador Kixtich. Individual hive members who remember personal preferences, creative expression, and decision-making based on emotional rather than logical criteria. Sarah looked around the chamber with an expression that combined professional satisfaction with what might have been genuine surprise. So you're all willing to send your least optimized, most inefficient, most unpredictable representatives to make first contact with the most advanced intelligence any of us has ever encountered? When stated in those terms, the strategy sounds. High Consul Thrix paused, his scales shifting through several color patterns as he searched for appropriate words. Insane. But strategically sound insanity may be exactly what this situation requires. The Altarian hegemony concurs, added Ambassador Veltar. Conventional approaches to superior intelligences have predictable failure modes. Unconventional approaches introduce variables that cannot be anticipated by either side. The collective consciousness calculates that unpredictability may be the only tactical advantage available when facing opponents whose capabilities exceed analytical prediction, clicked Ambassador Kixtich. Sarah Chan walked back to the center of the platform and sat down in her simple metal chair one final time. From this position, she could look directly at each of the major delegations, her human eyes meeting the various optical sensors and sensory organs that serve similar functions for other species. Then, we have our mission parameters. We're going to approach the builders not as representatives of galactic civilization's most advanced capabilities, but as examples of consciousness types that have preserved qualities their optimization process may have eliminated. We're going to offer them something they can't create for themselves: chaos, inefficiency, unpredictability, and the kind of creative irrationality that produces art, music, philosophy, and innovation. And if they're not interested, ask the Ethereal Collective. Then, at least we'll have learned something important about the nature of advanced intelligence and the potential costs of optimization, Sarah replied. But I think they will be interested, because if I'm right about their nature, then we represent something they haven't encountered in a very long time: truly alien intelligence. High Consul Thrix's massive head tilted with the kind of predatory attention that indicated he was beginning to understand the implications of Sarah's strategy. The builders may be technologically superior, but they may also be cognitively constrained by their optimization. They can solve engineering problems that exceed our capabilities, but they may be unable to ask the kinds of questions that lead to genuinely new insights. Exactly. And the most important question we can ask them isn't "What do you want from us?" or "How can we serve your purposes?" The most important question is the one that might genuinely surprise them. Which is, prompted Ambassador Veltar. Sarah Chan smiled for the first time since entering the chamber, her expression carrying the kind of quiet satisfaction that comes from solving a complex problem through unexpected means. When did you last do something that served no practical purpose except that it made you happy? When did you last change your mind about something important based on emotional rather than logical considerations? When did you last create something beautiful that contributed nothing to your efficiency or effectiveness? She stood up from the chair and walked toward the chamber's main exit, her movement casual and unhurried despite the magnitude of the decisions that had just been reached. When did you last waste time on something that mattered to you personally rather than to your civilization's advancement? When did you last act according to curiosity rather than optimization? When did you last do something inefficient just because it felt right? The questions echoed through the vast chamber as Sarah Chun reached the entrance and paused to look back at the assembled delegates one final time. Those are the questions we're going to ask the builders, not with words, but by demonstrating that consciousness can take forms they may have forgotten were possible. We're going to show them what intelligence looks like when it hasn't been optimized for maximum efficiency. She gestured toward the simple metal chair that had served as her position throughout the historic session. And we're going to do it from a position of genuine confidence rather than desperate supplication. Because if I'm right about this, then we have something to offer that they can't obtain through technological advancement or strategic optimization. "What's that?" called High Consul Thrix as Sarah reached the threshold of the chamber. "The experience of being genuinely, creatively, inefficiently alive," she replied, and stepped through the dilating entrance into the corridor beyond. The Galactic Council chamber fell into silence as the assembled delegates contemplated the implications of what had just occurred. For the first time in millennia, they had agreed to approach a challenge not by demonstrating their greatest strengths, but by embracing their most apparent weaknesses. And for the first time since the discovery of the wormhole builders, they found themselves looking forward to making contact. 6 weeks later, the joint expedition launched toward the nearest construction site. The mission roster included the galaxy's most advanced military technologies operated by species whose representatives had been selected not for their tactical brilliance, but for their appreciation of beauty. The expedition's communication array incorporated telepathic networks managed by Altarians who used their abilities for artistic collaboration. The scientific equipment was monitored by synthetic collective individuals who had preserved emotional decision-making algorithms despite their logical inefficiency. Ambassador Veltar served as the mission's telepathic coordinator, but his primary qualification was his ability to create shared consciousness experiences that served no practical purpose except aesthetic enjoyment. High Consul Thrix commanded the military escort, but He had been chosen because he composed music in his spare time, despite the complete irrelevance of such activity to draconic strategic doctrine. And Sarah served as expedition commander, qualified not by her engineering expertise or diplomatic training, but by her demonstrated ability to ask questions that force superior intelligences to examine their own assumptions about the nature of consciousness and the purposes of existence. When they reached the construction site and made their first attempt at contact, the builders' response was immediate and unprecedented in the recorded history of galactic civilization. They laughed, and then, for the first time in millennia, they asked a question of their own: what did you bring us? The answer would reshape both civilizations' understanding of what intelligence could accomplish when efficiency was not its only objective. But that, as Sarah noted in her final mission report, was a story for another time. The important thing was that they had learned to ask the right questions, starting with the most fundamental one of all. What do you fear about discovering that the universe is stranger and more beautiful than your optimization process ever allowed you to imagine?